Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome to a new reaction, and this is Dark Worlds and Darker Minds by Redacted Atlas. So, this was a suggestion I got off my Discord server by Babadook Spook, and I was just told that it's a good video that brings up a lot of new ideas. And judging by the thumbnail, it looks like it's going to kind of bring up just seemingly how Dark Worlds are formed, or how they can form differently based on who actually creates them. I mean, on the one side we have Chris with Tenna, and then on the other side we have Susie with the evil Gerson statue. And then in the middle we have the Knight with Queen and King. Again, I really don't know what this could be about, so I'm honestly really interested. Honestly, and just another thing, since talking about the thumbnail here, something I saw somebody point out on Twitter a couple of days ago, and the fact that when Susie goes and actually forms the Dark Fountain and stuff like that, she temporarily gains red eyes. The thing that Chris is very famous for having. So, and they were suggesting that it might be that red eyes are just a side effect or symptom of having large amounts of determination. So, again, that's a really cool little theory there, if that actually turns out to be true. But yeah, other than that, I don't have anything else to add, so let's actually get into this and get it started. So yeah, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video lead to my Let's Play of the day. And if you like this video or any other video that I make, I'd very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because over 3/4 of the people that watch my videos aren't subscribed, and I'd very much like that to change, because my next big goal is to hopefully hit 6,000 subscribers before the end of the year. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
Hello, people of the internet, my name is Atlas, and today I'm going to be doing an analysis over Deltarune's Dark Worlds, how they work, and what they can tell us about their creators, and the Lightners that visit them. If you enjoy, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment giving your own thoughts. In many ways, this video is something of a spiritual successor to my last, though it does stand on its own, so feel free to just go back after watching this video if you haven't seen the previous one.
Okay.
All that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. While I discussed darkness last time, it was mostly in the context of Darkners and Titans, and while these concepts may briefly come up here as well, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the Dark Worlds themselves, along with their creators. While there has been much discussion regarding the relation of Dark Worlds and Lightners since Chapter 2, and even 1 to some extent, 3 and 4 give us a bit more data to work with this concept, that I believe allows us to extract a bit more information from what we have. For example, Chapter 4 explicitly states that Dark Worlds are influenced via their creators, and are different when made by different people, with different intentions. While Chapter 3 seems to establish that the makeup of these Dark Worlds is not always purely subconscious, with the existence of Darkners such as King, Queen, Ram, and Tenna likely being a result of how Chris and the girl, whether it be Noelle and Des, treated them in the past. Now let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 1. Now, this is an interesting one, as I honestly think that, likely due to how little we knew at the time, Chapter 1 hasn't been revisited quite as much as the other chapters when it comes to this kind of discussion, with many assuming that since it's something of an introduction, not much can be gleaned from it. But I disagree. I honestly think there's a lot of angles we can look at it from which can enhance our experience. So, to start out, I think it's important to establish that I view Des as the Knight, and as such that's the primary lens through which I will analyze this Dark World, at least regarding what it has to say about its creator. Though I will also be talking about things outside of that as well, and I think this is the reading that leads to the most possible connections compared to, say, Carol or Rudy Knight. So first off, the location of the Dark World itself is already interesting, being Gerson's old classroom, where Des, along with classmates like Asriel, would have been taught.
Okay, so thinking about it, just for a second here, because I assume, or at least hope, that they're going to get into it here. But also thinking about it, so we assume that, the Knight or Des, depending on, if she actually is the Knight, created the Dark Worlds for chapters 1 and 2. Chris created the Dark World quite obviously for chapter 3. And then the Knight created the chapter 4 Dark World, and as well, the original one at least before Susie did, and all that sort of stuff. So thinking about it, you can see, well, there are similarities. We were able to see that, if there's a big enough difference, like the lighting of the Dark World would change. You know, when we went into the Dark World that Susie made, like literally, like all of their colors were different. But the Dark Worlds created by Chris and the Knight have the same lighting, even though they're made by different people. But at the same time, you look at, you know, the Dark Worlds created by the Knight, or who we assume is the Knight, you know, chapters 1, 2, and 4. Like, Chapter 1 Dark World, you know, it's the playfield, but like, you know, it has a dark black background. Chapter 2, Cyber City. There is the city in the background, but it's still dark black background on top of it all. But then you get to the Chapter 3 Dark World that Chris specifically made, and it was already just a lot brighter. And granted, we know that was partially because Tenna kind of took it over and turned it into his TV studio, but even then, like, there was a lot more just landscaped, and it did feel, even outside the areas that Tenna controlled, brighter and, I don't know, more energetic or something? So there is, even then, if you have, like, the two people that are, you know, on the same quote-unquote side, but just, like, the slight differences already in the Dark Worlds there. Huh.
Alvin implies as much through some of his dialogue with Chris, and I believe this is also what Azrael's illustration of Sham on his computer is meant to tell us. This could provide something of an explanation as to why this location was chosen in the first place. Not only would it be empty and hold some sense of sentimentality to Des, she'd probably have some pretty strong visions of what the world, and the Darkners inhabiting it, would be like. Especially if we assume that she's the girl Ram mentions playing with Chris. Even if she isn't, though, the fact that Gerson's room even has these things in the first place suggests that his teaching style was somewhat untraditional, focusing more on creativity and mental stimulation, both of which come together to create a perfect mindset for a dark world, which themselves represent fiction to some extent at least. Think of how, when you're a kid...
I mean, that kind of makes sense given the fact that he was literally a best-selling author. Which, on top of that, probably meant he didn't have to worry about, you know, a teacher's paycheck.
It's easy to create stories out of nearly anything, even mundane objects. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I would do this thing where I would walk in stores with my parents and just mash all sorts of things together in my mind to create, like, giant robots or something. You got the gist. This also fits given their function to the game itself. Not only do they function similar to video games in-universe, as Noel specifically points out, but without Dark Worlds, there would be no Deltarune. These in-universe representations of fiction are what allow for Deltarune to function as a work of fiction itself. It also seems like Dark Worlds are influenced by Lightners inside of them to some extent, which I'll get into more later. Now, viewing this through the idea that Dark Worlds are fiction, there are several ways we could interpret it. For one, fiction can be inspired by real people, even if they aren't the ones creating it. And two, it could also be in reference to the way that different people can interpret the same work of fiction in different ways.
I mean, just going back to that first, you know, point. I mean, how many times do you watch something and they specifically say that this is not based on, like, any person's living or dead? I mean, just because, you know, a character is similar to somebody doesn't mean that, you know, it's directly pulling from them.
Sometimes on a very personal level, and even if that wasn't intended on the author's part, that doesn't make the reading of the work invalid. And coming back to Chapter 1, this, of course, shines through the most with Susie. King is the most common example brought up here, and for good reason. I mean, the guy literally quotes her word for word.
God, yeah.
But it does go deeper than that. King's hatred doesn't come from nowhere. His spite towards the Lightners is the result of what he sees as their abandonment, likely after Gerson passed, leaving the classroom unused for who knows how long. This sense of isolation is also present in Susie, at least before Chapter 1. While it is true that she was a bully, it is also pretty clear that she just didn't know how to properly adjust to her new setting after moving time and time again, probably shown best when a ball was accidentally thrown over to her, and not knowing what to do, she freezes for a moment before kicking it, likely accidentally, into Undyne's car. King, and Lancer for that matter, also have eyes concealed by shadow, much like Susie, and King even has an extra mouth on his stomach, notable as Susie seems to be constantly hungry. This mouth also holds King's primary weapon, which could suggest that some of Susie's agitation is a result of that hunger.
Now, again, like and granted, these are mostly in, like, fan works, but, like, what is that hunger specifically? Is it simply just, you know, the fact she doesn't live in a good home, so doesn't always have access to, you know, a meal, so she literally goes hungry? And that's why she's always hungry? Or is there actually something wrong with her where, like, even though she eats a lot, she is always hungry? Honestly, it could go either way.
It's also notable that the aforementioned weapon that King uses, he dubs the Chain of Justice. Not only does this connect him to Gerson, which makes sense since he is the ruler of his classroom, but after Chapter 4, it serves as yet another tie to Susie, given her new title as the Acts of Justice. The use of the word justice is...
I'd honestly forgotten that he called his weapon that. Granted, it's been a long time since I played Chapter 1, but yeah.
Also interesting. It informs us that not only does King feel no shame in what he's doing, he thinks it's justified, which could imply that part of the reason Susie acted the way she did, or at least one of the ways that she battled with the guilt, was by telling herself that it was only fair. None of them have to deal with what she does, so she was just making things even. This is best supported by her encounter with Chris showed off in the newest girl page on the sweepstakes, where I think it becomes fairly clear that she was jealous of the family that Chris has, and tried her best to make them feel the way that she does. Susie also parallels Lancer. While they may seem like very different characters with very different vibes at first, both in Chapter 1 can be described as good kids who want to be seen as bad. Obviously, Lancer is a much lighter exploration of this idea, but it is that similarity that allows Susie to feel more comfortable hanging out with him in a friendly, casual manner, as it allows her to do so without the pressure of being good, or even acting particularly bad, since she's already on the side of the bad guys anyway. Susie's also implied not to have the best home life, which aligns with King and Lancer's relationship in Chapter 1. With a bit of an infamous line involving this dynamic being Susie's approval at prison being just for dads, though you don't necessarily have to read it that way.
God, that's another line I'd completely forgotten about. Wow, okay. So again, broken home life, and then there is that whole idea, and again, so I'm recording this after, the Undertale 10th anniversary stream that Toby did. And like, of course, a lot of things in that 10th anniversary edition, like there was, a little child Noel hiding behind a tree. There was what most people think might be Birdley's mom being a teacher at a high school in Hotland, if you haven't seen it. And while I haven't finished watching the second stream yet, I've seen a few pictures of people showing a child, a little kid version of Susie in the school as well or something. And I'm not sure if that's real or if somebody's just made that up. But just the idea that, she might not come from the best home, given that, a lot of people speculate that the room that Rousey showed during Chapter 3 when he's talking about what, Darkners actually are, a lot of people speculate that that's Susie's room. And I've seen some people speculate that, she's actually she lives alone in an abandoned building. Or, if, jail is a place for dads, then maybe she's, just living with her mom now, and maybe she's abusive, or it's... Honestly, either way, it sucks to be Susie.
Then there's obviously Jevil, who is certainly an interesting case. I think most also in a pretty desperate situation at the moment, being controlled by us, and forced to put up with us to survive. Not to mention
definitely
being in a poor situation with a knight that they also don't seem to be enjoying. Despite that though, in the normal route, and this is an important distinction, there isn't much of an indication that they're trying to completely solve these problems directly, understandably so, as it's probably taking all of their motivation just to live with them. Speaking of which, Sham had a hole on the Shadow Mantle at some point, another notable point because Chris wears a mantle themselves. Now, it's not entirely clear if it was originally Sham's or they somehow found it after it flew off of King, assuming that is the Shadow Mantle before it was stolen by Eram. Speaking of which, let's talk about King, because I think he may also have some interesting parallels to Chris.
Yeah, the fact he had
Obviously,
the Shadow
I mentioned
Mantle.
the Shadow Mantle, but I also find it interesting just how much King seems to worship the Knight, being by far their most loyal follower. Except, perhaps, Chris. Now, obviously, the situations here are a bit different. Like I said, there are indications that Chris isn't really thrilled about helping the Knight.
Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't say, Chris worships the Knight. I'd very much classify them under the reluctant follower category. They're very much doing it under duress, seemingly. Because, there was that whole thing where it's oh, Chris, you remember you promised, So they promised something, though what it is exactly is the question.
While King seems to have gone all in. But nevertheless, both Chris and King follow them to the point where they're willing to hurt those closest to them. Not necessarily physically, as Chris never actually harmed Susie or Rousey, nor does it seem like kidnapping Toriel was ever the True Knight's goal, and King claims to have never truly intended to harm Lancer. But nevertheless, Lancer was hurt by what King did, and Susie will no doubt be hurt when the truth comes out.
Oh, definitely.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but there's also Jigsaw Joe, who was fired by King and forced to work a different job, which left him quite down on money, which you could argue is something of a parallel to Asgore's current situation. On a similar note, there's also the
Asgore, Jigsaw Joe. Okay, there's a character connection I've honestly never seen before, or even thought of before. Okay, yeah, that's definitely a weird one.
Rudens and Ruden Rangers, whose whole thing is that they're easy to sway and really hate their jobs. Plus they're green and red, colors associated with Chris, and Ruden Ranger is even a Blade Elemental. And as far as Chris goes in Chapter 1, I think that's mostly it. Not as much as Susie, but still enough to warrant a mention. So finally, we can talk about the Knight, who, again, I'm going to assume is Des. And I think it's best if we start with the elephant in the room. Clover. I mean, just look at her room. Baseballs and pine trees? If that doesn't scream Des, I don't know what does. But aside from that, it does actually get a bit deeper. Because Clover doesn't just like sports and trees. They also like boys. And not just any boy, Rousey.
See, I remember that, I do remember that, because a while ago I saw somebody, they post a little bit of art on Twitter about it, where there was like, oh, why does nobody talk about this ship? And it was like, Rousey kind of like looking a bit uncomfortable, or a little bit flustered and uncomfortable, as like all three heads of Clover are kind of like looking behind him and like looking at him. It was honestly kind of adorable. But the connections between Clover and Des, and the obvious ship that is Desriel, between Des and Asriel. Huh. Okay, yeah, so they're, again, more very strange connections I've never thought of before.
Or, as I say, fluffy boys with glasses. And I think you can see what I'm getting at here. While Des and Asriel have not been totally confirmed as having a romantic relationship in the past, there have been increasing hints towards such a possibility.
Yeah.
Starting with the implication that she wore his jacket, his sweater appearing in her room, as well as his old retainer. However, there is one head of Clover that doesn't like boys, and what do you know, in some unused dialogue, she specifically likes Susie. This is notable because Chapter 3 tells us that Des liked music with alligators and bikinis, and Chapter 4 reveals that she once had a hold of the How to Draw Dragons book. Now, as for why Clover of all characters parallels Des this much, well, we do first meet her when she's submerged underground, perhaps referencing Des's appearance in the bunker. There is always the popular idea that she could have been split into parts, with the Knight being one and the voice in the code being the other.
I've said that many times. That's honest. That's a theory I subscribe to very heavily.
Much like how Clover is also split into multiple different people. Though, if this is the case, it would seem to imply that there's another Des we haven't really heard from yet. But truthfully, I think the most convincing and funniest answer is that it's because Clover is a club. And you know what else is a club? A bat. Going back to King again, I'm tempted
Boo!
to make a connection between him and Carol, if for no other reason than them both being bad parents. Though, now that I think about it, it is interesting that the two Dark Worlds with proper main antagonists made by the Knight have both be blue, considering Carol's sense of fashion. Des Knight can also provide another explanation for the Chain of Justice line.
Also, just thinking about it, so, of the two, bosses that are parents, King and Queen, King, they're thinking about it, they're obviously like mirrors almost, because you have King here, the very strict, like, all evil father figure, while, Noelle is the very strict, very tough mother. But then in Chapter 2, we have Queen, who, is the villain, quote unquote, but she's very fun-loving, very silly, almost mirroring Rudy in a way. Huh, okay.
As Des, having been in this classroom and taught under Gerson, would see him as the boss of the classroom in a way, so the boss of this Dark World having a similarity with him does make sense. The entirety of the card castle as well as the scissor dancer things are entirely black and white, something also shared by the Knight. There's also a bit of a recurring start motif in this Dark World, which Des is also connected to from her room and the Fallen Star book, with stars appearing on both the trees as consumable items, and perhaps more notably, in this room with the scissor dancers.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also part of the secret boss quest, with Sham specifically saying to walk where the stars don't shine. There's also 2 whole mazes, though one of them is more of a joke. But in the other, you have to not follow Lancer Susie to avoid getting lost, which both generally references Des and perhaps the children following the pointed tail thing, along with seemingly the Ice Palace from Dragon Blazers. And with that, I think I'm finally ready to move on to Chapter 2. That took longer than I thought, but luckily I think things get more direct for a while from here.
Oh god, wait, this entire section was just talking about Chapter 1, right? Oh, okay. Wow. Okay.
Starting off, let's talk about something influenced by nearly all the Lightners involved in this Dark World. Queen and Universal Mother Theory. If you aren't familiar with this theory, I'll leave a link to it in the description for you to check it out, but for the sake of this video, the main things you need to know is that it proposes Queen's relationship with the Lightners are parallel to that of their actual mothers. And I believe that the new chapters seem to further hint at it with Carol's design reveal, Toriel drinking wine, and Miss Boom, who seems to be something of a mother figure towards Birdly, calling him Burgley, just like Queen. There's also the December puzzle, which connects to both.
I had completely forgotten about that. Huh.
Noelle and Birdly through the spelling bee, and Des through it as well, with it being her name. Plus the baseball moon for a much more specifically Des
Baseball moon, yeah,
we
right.
have all the cat stuff, which is associated with Noelle, given the cat petters and friend stuff, as well as her friendship with Caddy, along with some bird characters like Swatch and Swatchlings, which, you know, makes sense because of Birdly.
Yeah.
Even more so given his intense desire to impress Queen, and the Swatch and Swatchlings' role as her biggest supporters. Noelle is also connected to Spampton through Peepus, and being the only one to respond to his emails. Speaking of Spampton, we have more Chris parallels. This time, even more
very
clear
much
with
all the
Spampton
control
literally
stuff.
being a puppet who, well, he doesn't die, but he can't really last when his strings are cut. Oh yeah, and he literally has a heart on a chain. Spampton also connects a lot onto Chris, and sometimes he can
almost like King as well. Because again, like, I know King's thing is a spade, but if you turn a spade upside down, it looks a lot like a heart.
Can hit uncomfortably close to home with what he says, and that's not even mentioning his divorce trauma. Speaking of which, Noelle says the frayed bow tie reminds her of Asgore, and Spampton seems to specifically have sold cars, something that Asgore seems to have interest in given the magazine on his counter, which could also suggest an influence from Chris. Noelle also finds the experience of going to Spampton's store with Chris to be nostalgic, and the weird route in general connects to her childhood, as well as her tendency to find weird things in games.
Nostalgic.
I see who both Chris and Noelle are connected to also appears in this Dark World. As for Susie, there's not a ton with her this time, though we do know that she's a fan of kaijus, and we do get ourselves a giant fight in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
I also think it's possible that the fact that she seems to have a fairly lighthearted adventure with Rousey this time around could also reflect her own perception of the Dark Worlds at this point. Going back to the kaiju thing though, this is also an idea connected to the night, which feels even more intentional given this is the chapter that Titans are revealed in, right after the Giga Queen fight no less.
Right.
Plus, when Spampton Neo uses his special attack, he too grows to an enormous size, and does an attack quite similar to the Titans when his shield is down.
Okay, so they definitely were right. There are a lot of connections here I've never thought of before. That's really interesting.
That's how Chapter 1 had the runes, Chapter 2 has the werewires, which also have no control just like Chris, but this time there's the additional parallel of them being made stronger by the wire's control. Chapter 3 is again quite a bit more direct. Chris is really written all over the place here. Now, obviously, some of this can be attributed to the fact that it takes place at their home, but I think we can read a bit more into it than that in a few places. For one, Chapter 3 borrows an interesting amount from other Dark Worlds, having a very similar opening to the cliffs from Chapter 1, the inclusion of previous puzzle types, Darkners we've already seen, and multiple references to the Cyber World and more. I think this is meant to indicate that Chris was inspired by the night when creating the fountain, which works quite well when viewing the Dark Worlds as an analogy for fiction.
Okay, yeah, that could definitely, inspired by them, yeah. And then again, like, my whole thing before that I was talking about how they were seemingly so similar, but there were stark differences, yeah. Them just being inspired, that definitely does work.
Also, I mentioned before that I found it interesting that King and Queen, our main antagonistic forces in Chapters 1 and 2, are blue because of Carol, who likely had a complicated relationship with Des based off of her current behavior. And what do you know? When Chris creates a Dark World, the main antagonists were red, perhaps to echo their own antagonistic relationship with us, the player. Speaking to Tenna, while King and Queen seem to have an inherent...
Again, they really are, like, Red, Soul, again, so many things I had never even considered before. This is nuts.
Attachment to the knight once their fountains were created, albeit to various extremes, the same does not seem to apply to Tenna. Yes, he is doing something that the knight wants, but he seems to be doing it because Chris was the one who told him to. We even see him get actively frustrated at the knight for taking so long, while he's distracting the fun game. In general, I think a lot of Chapter 3's weirdness comes from the fact that it was someone else that made the fountain, from the less linear plot of the chapter to the completely different Shadow Crystal plotline. This chapter, at least until the ending, also serves as another fairly light adventure, one that Susie certainly needs after learning the truth in the docks.
Again, like, still thinking back, Toby, the reason Toby thought people wouldn't like Chapter 3 was because it was gimmicky. But it's gimmicky because Chris made it and was inspired by the other Dark Worlds. Huh, okay.
And while Tenna definitely parallels Chris the most, Susie does pretty clearly relate to his feelings of abandonment and helplessness. Honestly, the fact that he and Susie get along so well might partially be because Chris likes her so much.
Yeah.
And of course, the previously mentioned divorce between Tenna and Spamton is honestly even more prominent here than in Chapter 2, where we can see it really taking its toll on Tenna, which makes sense considering how much Asgore and Toriel's divorce has affected Chris's life. This is only further supported by La Niño's and El Niño's relationship problems as well. Tenna also has a tendency to deny and avoid addressing his main issues.
Just like Toriel. Okay, yeah, everything's coming into full circle here, okay.
When the gang finds Toriel, he simply sends them right into the next round like nothing ever happened. And when they resist, he continues to pretend that everything is fine and going just as planned. To some extent, I think this applies to both Toriel and Asgore, with Asgore forcing himself to think that if he can prove his innocence, everything will go back to normal, and that he's in anything resembling an okay position in life. Toriel's tendency to leave problems indirectly addressed, with Toriel in particular shining through here given she's literally asleep and ignorant to everything happening around her the entire
chapter, yeah.
Ram is also interesting. People have pointed out that he has some similarities to Sans, but given Chris's lack of a relationship with him at this point, something that I think is a bit more relevant here is his similarities to Asgore. For one, both seem to be British, but more importantly, the way the rest of the Dark World rejects him, the fact that he doesn't belong, and the fact that he tries to make things go back the way they were originally for Chris's sake, all align fairly well with what we know of Asgore's character. Though the fact that he doesn't belong may also stem from Chris's own insecurities as well, especially considering he's a plug boy which become werebuyers.
So, oh god, if that's the case, if there are, pretty strong connections between Ram and Asgore, what does that say about the possibility of an Asgore fight in Chapter 5? Oh, does that mean we might not get an Asgore fight? Oh, I know so many people would be angry if that's the case.
Tess and the incidents surrounding her disappearance are also written all over this chapter. And while some of this could stem from the Knight's presence in it, if we assume that they're hiding somewhere the entire time, I personally prefer the idea that this implies Chris is deeply haunted by whatever happened. And considering that it may be the reason they created this world in the first place, it makes sense that it would hang over it the entire time. Finally, there's Chapter 4, and this one is a bit of a doozy, because it technically contains 3 different Dark Worlds. Well, kinda.
Well, like, 2 of them, it's like 1.5, and then another one, so...
Based on Ralsei's dialogue, it would seem the first fountain is actually just part of the third. What I think happened here is that the Knight initially created a fountain in the main area of the church. However, at some point, they closed and locked the door to the entrance, which led to some of the darkness being locked off, which then concentrated it into its own mini fountain. Hence why it's so much smaller than all the others we've seen, and why the darkness from the first half of the church can appear in the second. Since once the doors were open, I'm guessing the darkness once more spread inside, and allowed the Darkners their life once more. When it comes to the first fountain and its relation to the Knight, things are a bit different again. Notably, we don't have a central antagonistic Darkner this time, which may be due to the fact that the Knight simply doesn't need one since they're already acting as such, and may have already planned on summoning a Titan. The Darkners here are more aware of the Knight than the others we've seen, but unlike them, they oppose it, but unfortunately mistake Chris for it, leading to most of the fights we see throughout the chapter. The Dark World is also fairly musical, with a lot of piano organ things, as well as singers with the mizzles. While some of this most certainly comes from the choir room, keyboard, and organ we see in the light world, the abundance of this motif may partially be due to Des's clear musical abilities. Though with the piano specifically, it is worth noting that they're also significant to both Chris and Susie, with the piano clearly being special to Chris, and Susie having an unfortunate experience with one in the past. Darkness is also much more prevalent in this chapter, with these little guys being a recurring obstacle and the Titan spawn appearing when there's very little light.
I talking about, like, what are these things even just in the first place? Like, is there actually, like, a given name for them? Or are they just, like, unnamed black little shadow fuzzy things? Like, I haven't heard anybody actually refer to these things by an actual name, and yet they appear, and yet they, they're pretty prominent in the chapter.
Perhaps because of the Knight's presence in the Dark World given their similar makeup. The most interesting part of this Dark World, though, is the fact that it created the Old Man, Gerson. Ralsei says darkness patterned after the memories of a loved one tend to only appear in very specific darknesses, which seems to imply that Gerson could be considered a loved one to the Knight, or at the very least that they had some kind of connection to him before he passed, which fits nicely with Des, given she was most likely his student. In fact, looking at the fiction analogy, it's honestly kind of touching, as it suggests he was inspired by Gerson, who himself was a famous fiction writer. Speaking of, like Chapter 1, Chapter 4 is much more similar to the traditional fantasy setting, likely due to the shared connection to Gerson and therefore Lord of the Hammer. Speaking of Gerson, there is also of course his connection to Susie, and the fact that they seem to have a similar philosophy regarding freedom, with Gerson encouraging Susie's prophecy-denying tendencies. Not to mention the fact that the Dark World creates an axe for some reason. As for the rest of this portion of the Dark World, though, there isn't too much to say. The organics being a bit pretentious could represent Susie's general lack of enthusiasm regarding religion.
Honestly, so actually thinking about it, now I'm wondering, so the axe is generally assumed that, Susie's axe is something in the Dark World. Like, I think it was her first one was like a hairbrush or something. So what is this axe going to be, in the light world? Like, what real-world object is it based off of? Because we know, a lot of, Chris's weapons are, like, pencils and pens and stuff like that. So, like, what could be in a desk or something that, Susie could have taken as a weapon in the Dark World?
And the Mizzles, being not just princesses, but damsels in distress while also being choir members, could be due to Susie's concern for Toriel's safety. After all, part of the reason they came here in the first place was to save her. However, things get really interesting with Susie's Dark World, which is essentially a reflection of the first. And immediately, I think we can see her influence. Instead of playing pianos, you use them to bash into things, which relates to her story regarding smashing one.
Yeah.
Items in the last Dark World have come to life, perhaps to indicate that Susie has begun to treat items as people, as shown by how when she's talking about the TV or the Scarecrow, she doesn't refer to them as their items, instead acting as if they were their Dark World counterparts of Tenna and Jagenstein. There's also something else I want to say about Susie's Dark World before moving on, involving its different lighting. Now, I've seen some say that this implies the general way colors work in the dark are entirely dependent on the creator of the fountain, and their intentions, with Chris's being the same as the Knight due to the fact that they are working together.
Yeah?
And while I can't entirely discount this possibility, I personally think it's more likely that the reason for the change in lighting is specifically because Susie had already been in this Dark World before. Therefore, it was literally tainted by her perception of it.
So, the reason could be because she was specifically trying to recreate the Dark World instead of just creating a Dark World from scratch. Okay, yeah, so you almost get that, like, off-color sort of feel to it. Yeah, okay, I could see that.
And the reason I say this is because there are several times in this Dark World where the lighting changes yet again, and seemingly reveals that under it, Chris, Susie, and anything else are still their default Dark World looks. Namely, whenever you enter a battle, and in the scene after the Sound of Justice fight, which itself is very heavily tinted blue, but through flashes of lightning reveals their true colors. The girl from the prophecy is everywhere here as well, which works whether you think it's Susie or Noelle, because of course Susie would be referenced in her own Dark World, but she's also known to think about Noelle quite a lot, with these prophecies showing up even more as her curiosity is piqued.
Right,
As for the Sound of Justice, I think something similar applies, but with the addition of her desire to see the old man again. After all, that was her original intention while making the fountain. But because the old man can't exist in the darkness, the Dark World gives her something else instead. Eventually, though, we're able to exit and enter the final Dark World of this chapter proper. And to be honest, there isn't a ton to say about this one that I haven't already, so I'm going to go ahead and briefly talk about the real final Dark World of this video.
Yeah, the third one.
Castletown.
Oh, never mind.
Now, we have no idea who made Castletown, if it was even made by a person. And the actual Dark World itself seems pretty barren, so it's hard to make any judgments based off of that alone.
And on top of that, Rousey specifically mentions that the fountain of this Dark World, of the Castletown Dark World, is like pure darkness. So whatever that means, like whether it's not tainted by like a person or by like a person's intention or something like that, it's like it's pure as in like any Darkner from any other Dark World can live here and exist as they were without being altered in any way.
There is Rousey, who pretty clearly connects to Chris, but aside from that, there isn't much. The entire kingdom itself is empty, and I think that's sort of the point. If Dark Worlds are fiction, then I see Castletown as a blank page. A dream that grows with care, as the game puts it. Essentially, if Dark Worlds are the person who creates its stories, Castletown, Player Town, is our story that we get to build up as we please. That's why it's named after us, why we're able to shape it as we will. Put Darkners in certain places, recruit specific Darkners to build the town that we wish.
Oh, okay. Now I get it. That's why the chapter of of this part of the video is called A Blank Page Just for You. Okay.
That's why there's so much angel imagery in the castle. Now, because of that, there isn't necessarily a ton of Lightner character analysis to be done here, but it feels significant nonetheless. So, in conclusion, I think the Dark Worlds can help inform us about the Lightners who make them, as well as the ones who venture in them. And I think that this is something that we should continue to look out for in the future, as it can not only give us insight into our heroes, but our main antagonists as well. I mean, who knows? Maybe Asgore will create the next fountain and we'll get something of an exploration into his mind from it.
Yeah,
we'll just have to wait and see.
Here's hoping.
All that being said, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe for more, and leave a comment giving your own thoughts. Drink water, remember to floss, and don't forget, the impossible is possible. All you gotta do is make it so. Good night.
Again, like a lot of they were definitely right. There are a lot of connections that I had honestly just never thought of before. And again, like that stuff I brought up before about the weird mirroring of Carol and Rudy to King and Queen. Huh. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that was a very informative video, and thank you for suggesting it. But yeah, that's definitely going to be it for now. So yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.